Good morning, everyone who has tuned in and is joining this stream this morning. Welcome to Silverleaf. Welcome to Country Living Essential programs and presentation. We thank you that you have joined us today. We also want to welcome those who will watch later on and not necessarily now. We trust that, what will be shared this morning will be a blessing unto all of us. Just an announcement before I introduce our presenters today. We had a session with Rovano a few weeks ago where he presented about food preservations. The presentation was theoretical. So there is a second installment that is planned for 15 September, which will be very practical, and we encourage you to please attend, tune in, and be blessed. We are also encouraged to bring whatever preservations that you have that we can discuss. It will be very interactive, the 15 September session. Just about today, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to share. But don't use the YouTube channel, but use our phone number, which will be displayed on the screen. Please send a text, please send a WhatsApp. We will respond to your comment and question as and when you raise it. Before we start, shall we say a word of prayer and invite God's blessings and presence to be with us. Father, in the name of Jesus, we come before you this morning. We are grateful, Father, to have the opportunity to learn about essentials with respect to country living. We pray that, Father, you will bless us. Pray that, Father, as this presentation is done and we are educated, Father, you will help us, Father, to be armed with information and we can make decisions that are informed. And we pray that, Father, will bless each and every one of us who will listen, who will participate, and who will partake. And I pray that, Father, will bless in a very special way Nordely and David, who will share and present to us, Father. May they minister to us, and may we all be blessed as we partake in this program. We ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay. Our presenters for this morning is David and Nordely Wright. As they start, I'm going to ask them just to share a little bit about who they are and their expertise, with respect to today's topic, which is water and irrigation management. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pastor
Thank
Mtunzi.
you.
A bit about myself, David Wright. I grew up in the water industry in that my father worked for the city of Cape Town all of my childhood. So I grew up around fresh water and from there studied mechanical engineering and went into the water industry myself for 9 years. And gained a lot of general knowledge. Water is a very diverse topic, and to call yourself a specialist in any right, you would diversify into a particular field. But that's where I'm coming from.
And yes, so my name's Nordely Wright, and I studied agriculture. I studied soil science and chemistry for my undergraduate degree, and then actually worked on my master's, a specific topic looking at irrigation management using certain products that are available today in agriculture. So my expertise is not really for my current job in irrigation itself, but over the years, of course, you learn a lot about irrigation in the agricultural context. So using those principles will be, in my area, we'll look a lot at the principles and so on, and how to apply those then on a more small-scale farming system. Yeah, so that's us. I think, we'll start a little bit with an overview, and then David will present his section first, and then I'll be after that.
That's the plan. Okay, water and irrigation management. Water is one of the most important resources in all areas of creation. It's an essential to survival on this planet. We are blessed to be on the blue planet, and as custodians, we really need to view water from all sides, the way we use it and manage it and dispose of it. So let's discuss the needs and use and management of water for country living as well as for urban life. Just the outline, we'll be dealing with catchment management, water quality, water purification systems, distribution and storage, and irrigation management is the portion that Nordely will deal with. Okay, catchment management. Water is a precious resource, and catching it when it is still pure and managing it from there is kind of the optimal place to be. Any town or city will try and secure their catchment area. And the types of water sources, the best and the one that we all hope to taste one day is running from the throne of God. Revelation 22, verse 1 and 2. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And in the middle of its streets and on either side of the river was a tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. As mentioned, water is a beautiful resource that will even be in heaven. Its ability as to dilute and to absorb nutrients and various things is amazing, and it has so many properties which we will touch on lightly, but I think we will study it for many years to come, and in heaven maybe some of the answers will be given one day. So other sources of water that are more localized and in our daily lives, tap water is one that is a huge blessing, and I think we've all seen degradation in certain areas in the country and so forth, and we'll touch on some of the reasons for that. Precipitation, it's raining outside now. I don't know if the viewers can hear it, but it's falling on the roof outside here. Surface water, once it's landed, the routes that it takes, and groundwater, the seepage that runs into the earth, and ends up running down rivers somehow and landing up in the oceans and the seas. And then reclaimed water, which is the other side of urban life. I think when you get really desperate, that one comes into play to a large degree. Knowing your catchment, I think it's pertinent that everyone gets to know where their water is coming from. Many of us who live in towns and cities are used to opening a tap and taking that for granted. And I think we potentially have noticed changes in flavor and various things over seasons, and that's all got to do with the catchment and what's happening there. So the mountains, rural land, urban land, rooftops, each catchment has its own challenge. So make it your business to know what happens upstream, whether you're in a town or in the country somewhere on a farm. You need to know what's happening there, and so that you can prepare to treat it, to know how to use it, when it's potentially unsafe, and so forth. Manage the purity, quantity, and the pressure head of the catchment where possible. So purity, we've just discussed. If you are blessed to be close or have the watershed in your own land, then manage that as best you can. alien vegetation and so forth will definitely affect the quantity, purity potentially as well. The head and the pressure, yeah, if you are blessed to have water at height, then try and secure it at that height to make use of the pressure downstream, as opposed to collecting it further downstream and having to pump and so forth. Manage your downstream impact responsibly. So each household, each farming activity, there is waste that comes from that, and especially water treatment as well. We'll touch on that a bit later, but keep that in mind. Parameters to evaluate when assessing water sources. Try to determine your water demand for household use, gardening, crops, so forth. And yeah, you've either blessed to have a source and then decide how much is available and how you're going to use it, or you're going to be seeking a source. So confirm the supply, flow, and pressure. That can also be seasonal, so be aware of that. Water quality fluctuates with seasons, as we've all known, with flooding and so forth, as well as the dry season, where there's still waste and things which are less diluted. So the concentrations of minerals and various things in the dry season will fluctuate. And contamination potential. So whatever your water source, kind of brainstorm and do a bit of a risk analysis on what potentially could be coming downstream, what could be coming through your tap, and be prepared to test for it, and kind of markers that you want to look out for. Flood potential, wherever you are. In the Helderberg Basin, where we are situated, this last winter season, we've had a lot of water coming through, and flooding predominantly to saturated grounds and so forth, but also the catchment area, being blessed to be in a basin of mountains. When the water lands there, it's got to go somewhere, and it comes through town. So this is an indicator of a pear-shaped water catchment area. You can imagine all the water that's landing back here has to come through this little poort in Afrikaans, a gorge. And when it comes through, if there's been a cloudburst or something, the potential for a flash flood is great. So knowing what the lay of the land is upstream, and where you position your dwellings, your crops, your equipment, and so forth, keep that in mind. Boreholes. This is an interesting topic to have under catchment area, but what's under the land that you are situated on, and what's influencing the aquifers below. Do a Google Earth search, try work out what's in the area, which direction it's potentially flowing in, and yeah, get to know where the risks are, test for it, and so forth. So I've put in a bit of a sketch here of the various types of aquifers. So you have the river running through, you have infiltration on the mountains and hills, and any permeable piece of ground that then runs through the soil if it hasn't done surface runoff. And there are various types of aquifers. So if you have a silty clay layer, you're going to have a perched aquifer which can't penetrate to the deeper layers. So once you start drilling, you might hit water at that depth and then go deeper to a different depth. Each one of these aquifers will have a different water quality, and it's a fine line between having a good water source in terms of volume versus quality, and so forth. So the drillers, it's a science in its own right, but educate yourself around the potential of drilling through a good aquifer into a potentially brack or more salty aquifer, and how to deal with that, and the seasonal use of your borehole. If you can imagine the sand and gravel, if you sink a well in that area, you are basically extracting from a sponge. So the type of well that you put in will then be different. So yeah, that's aquifers. Location, it's a mystic art, water divining. Some people believe in it and so forth, but nowadays we have Google Earth and loads of data available, and geohydrologists are the guys to go to if you want some proper advice, specialized advice in that area. It's worth the money. They will come onto your property and assess, and it's always a gamble drilling a hole for water. Not always. There are aquifers that we know of that you'll definitely get to, but invest in the location. Drilling a hole is expensive. Drillers, choose them wisely, speak to neighbors, get references and so forth, and then start making a list of expectations from them. A yield test is something that once the driller says he's hit water, he's happy and so forth, make sure he gives a good yield report, drilling report as well. Yeah, there are various methods of doing these things, and once again, nowadays, Google's your friend. There's loads of information available on these things. Contamination, be aware of the position of your hole and the fact that when there's a flood, when there's a spill, when there are animals running around, whatever, secure your hole. Cast a plinth around it to make sure it's raised, make sure you cap it properly. It still does need to vent a bit, so deal with that with a bit of structure. Pumps, ball pumps, it's also a good yield test, and keeping in mind that seasonality of the aquifer's volume could be changing. So when you size a pump, and get some professional advice on that you keep that consideration in mind, that in winter your aquifer is going to be at a higher level, and the pump will need to perform differently. A dip tube is something that my dad recommended, which makes a lot of sense. If you can imagine a hole in the ground that you throwing a cable and various control cables down with a pump on the end and a pipe on, how do you test the depth? So there are electronic devices available, but an easy one is just to have a piece of irrigation pipe descending down with your borehole pipe, pump and pipe, and that gives you access to put in a dip stick or rope or something with a little weight on it, and you can, with that, determine the depth of your aquifer at any time in a season. Okay, applicable legislation. So this is potentially, well, I've listed a couple of the acts, and the Constitution deals with water. It is a basic requirement in life. But just be aware that there are laws applicable, and as we can read at the bottom here, all water users need to register with the Department of Water Affairs. You must register for water use if you do not receive water from a service provider, local authority, water board, irrigation board, government water scheme, or other bulk supplier, and are using water for industrial use, irrigation, mining purposes, etc. I've been involved with 2 such applications, and yeah, it's the water use one on the industrial side where I was involved. They took the surface area of our land and gave us a free portion and said any use above this will need to be charged for, and they would reassess how much is available, which makes a lot of sense, that they are custodians of the water sources in our country and need to manage that and make sure that it's fairly distributed, and those that want more are paying a premium for it. Water quality. So this is a very important starting point for any water treatment and water use. So the definition and context. The term water quality describes the physical, chemical, biological, and aesthetic properties of water that determines its fitness for a variety of uses. Many of these properties are controlled or influenced by constituents which are either dissolved or suspended in water. Drinking water. So we have a South African national standard, SANS 241, which deals with drinking water analysis standard. So if you want to have your municipal water tested, what's coming out your tap, it's will cost you a bit, but you're welcome to do that. But if you are out in the country somewhere and want to assess the fitness of the water that you have, then ask for a SANS 241 test. It'll deal with the 4 risks, namely the acute, aesthetic, chronic, and operational risks. Acute being one that needs to be dealt with immediately, so that's one you don't want to play with. Aesthetics is more, yeah, as mentioned, taste, odor, color, and so forth. It's not great, but you could live with it. Chronic is something that's going to build up over time, so you can consume it, but be aware that there are certain limits, and historically people that have grown up on farms with boreholes and so forth, they've picked up issues due to this chronic accumulation of minerals and things which are out of spec for a healthy lifestyle. Then operational, there are markers that can get picked up in drinking water, which point back to the treatment process. So that's an indication, as well as things that are going to foul up your pipes more upcountry where you have harder waters with a lot of minerals. In the Cape, we have softer waters, meaning more acidic, and they can also, as opposed to reducing the size of your pipe, it's going to start corroding it, which is also an issue. Okay, the South African Water Quality Guidelines is a document that was set up in 1996, and it saw the need to consolidate a lot of knowledge, both global knowledge and local knowledge, and this was set up focused on South African water use and issues with supply and the water that's available. So it's around 250 pages, but as you can see, it's nicely set up in volumes. Go to it as a reference when needed. When you have your water sample analyzed and you get the results and you have questions, it will deal with all those issues. It's a really great resource. Water sampling, as mentioned, having water analyzed is expensive, and incorrect water sampling techniques will affect the analysis results. So don't waste your money by sending in a poor sample. Take time to do a bit of research, put a bit of thought into it. Choose the flow rate, flow period, and season strategically. So flow rate, once you've had your borehole tested for an optimal yield, maybe I didn't touch on that as much as I could have, but boreholes, there's flow coming in from the sides. If you can imagine, you extracting and you're dropping the level. You don't want to drop it too much and run a hole dry, but the more you pump out of a hole, the more flow you are increasing, and that could change the quality of the borehole water for various reasons, including encouraging algal growth and various things, because you are now pushing a lot more minerals through a centralized point, and you end up with fouling in the borehole, which in the long run is going to mean that cause clogging, basically. So clean your sample point. If it's a tap, sample points in municipal areas and so forth would be a brass tap with a tapered nozzle that's running 24/7. So they know that if they take a sample from there, it is reflective of what is in the pipeline that's going past it. They will burn it with a torch to sterilize it. If you are sampling from river water or whatever, make sure that you're doing a bit of a pre-filtration, so you're not ending up with any large pieces of organic matter. That will affect the sample in many respects. Use a clear 2-liter plastic bottle. Plastic is actually better for samples. So make sure it's clean, but rinse it with sample water, so that you make sure that if there is any contamination, you're diluting it with a sample. So give it a good rinse 3 times, throw it out. Wear gloves, try not to breathe over the sample until you've closed it. Just like with canning and food preservation, make sure the lid is clean and well sealed. Once you've sealed the bottle, write the date, time, location on it. Usually you would make contact with the lab that's going to be doing the analysis for you. They would probably send you something to work on in terms of what they require, but those 3 points are critical. And then store the bottle in a cool, dark place and get it to the lab as soon as possible. Use a cooler bag with ice if necessary. I know many farms and things are hours away from a lab, so keep that in mind and check with the lab that's going to be doing the analysis in terms of what you want tested, and they will also give good advice on how to preserve that sample. Okay, water purification systems. So once you got your sample back and you know what you're dealing with, then you need to start approaching your water use. Look at the risk of harm versus investment in treatment. So as mentioned, your water analysis is going to give you pointers, and most samples that I've seen have an issue, and that limitation, look at it and see how you want to deal with it. It's going to cost you money, so choose a water treatment system that will depend on the water source, quality needed, household versus irrigation, and demand volumes. Go through those strategically and make a plan with that. All good. Okay. Most water sources will have limitations, as mentioned. So either you work with the limitations or you invest in a system. Nordely will touch a bit more on the crop side of that. So plants and various types of plants are a lot more forgiving. They are actually used in the purification of water, especially wastewaters. Plants are very useful, so keep that in mind. And if you're working on a system that's for drinking water, that's usually the purest form that you need on a farm or in a lifestyle. So size that accordingly. Don't go put in a system for the whole plant aimed at drinking water. So you might end up with various systems. And then dilution is a solution to pollution. So if you have fresh mountain water available, but the volumes aren't great, and you have a bore that's yielding good volumes, but the water quality is not great, mix those two waters until you get to a water that is usable. So that dilution rate is also something that will be seasonal, but something to keep in mind. Water disinfection. I'm sure many people are against chlorine and so forth, but there's a reason that it's so popular and served civilization well over the last few decades, that it's been used, centuries, that chlorine has been used as a disinfectant. Firstly, you can use it in the gaseous phase, which is the cheapest for bulk water. In the solid phase, I'm sure many of you have had the joy and woe of dealing with a swimming pool, but HTH and that sort of thing is readily available. And then in a liquid in the form of sodium hypochlorite or even chlorine dioxide in liquid form. It's a great sterilizer, and one of the better reasons, besides it's the economy of it, is it can be monitored. So drinking water, they aim at a ppm of between, say, 0.2 and 0.5, ppm being parts per million. And it's called residual-free chlorine. So once chlorine has disinfected the water, it's what's left in the water. And it's a great way to monitor and quickly assess if water is drinkable as such, so not having any harmful bacteria and so forth. They can test for this free chlorine and say, okay, there's still chlorine available, it is clean. And at that rate, you'll still get a bit of algal growth and so forth. Once again, referring to the swimming pool example, where you're aiming for, say, 3 ppm. Drinking water, it's lower than 0.5 ppm. So that's kind of 6 times less. And we all know if your pool runs out of chlorine, it goes green quite quickly. And then storage. Once you've chlorinated, as mentioned, you've got a residual that will run out with time of gas and be consumed in various manner. And the post-storage reservoir and so forth, they would usually boost the chlorine a little bit before sending it to town again. Once again, to be able to monitor it at various points. So we'll touch on that in filtration, but if you know you are closer to a water storage site in a town or city, then your chlorine levels will be slightly higher. Ultraviolet radiation or UV is very popular. It does not have a residual effect, so it will zap whatever it needs to, and then the water is disinfected, but anything after that could be an issue. So if you have any form of pollution in any way, the water will not be as safe as chlorinated. Yeah, a water treatment works. This all comes into play with disinfection in mind. So if we start with the influent water from your water source, hopefully it's a pure source, you're going to have a screen, just a crude filter of sorts to keep out leaves and any major particles, potentially a silt trap to drop any suspended solid sands and things that you can remove at that point. Then you would add lime in the Cape to change the pH, because, as mentioned, our low pH waters, you are going to start corroding your infrastructure if you don't drop the pH, as well as the pH needs to be in a specific range for the next step, coagulation or flocculation, which if any of you have dealt with a green swimming pool and you've added a bit of alum powder, gave it a mix, and the next morning you walk outside and the swimming pool is clear blue with a layer of green sludge at the bottom. That's basically what happens in the water industry. In the Cape, our tea-colored waters, that color is actually removed through this process. And it is a quick and efficient way of doing things. You can do that in batches, like with the swimming pool. You can fill a tank and flocculate it out. Then from there, you would skim off the clean water and send it to the next phase. Well, in the sedimentation basin in the water treatment works, it basically just slows down the flow to a point where the sludge will settle out. And then you have sludge and you have clean water. So sludge is usually dewatered through centrifugal press or evaporation. You'd push out your sludge onto an evaporation bed, and once all the water has disappeared, you'd scrape off the sludge and deal with it accordingly. Or the sludge that's been extracted will go to a landfill site where they will deal with it. And after the sedimentation, you would come into a rapid sand filter. Often there is a chlorination point just before this. But basically it's a sand filter. You've got your dirty water coming in and clear water coming out. Once again, you would need to backwash that and end up with more sludge, which either you send back to the beginning of the system and it will come through your sedimentation basin as sludge again, or you would backwash it and aim it downstream or wherever you find a use for it. And that's where disinfection actually comes in a system. So hopefully your water is clean enough that you don't need all these steps, but keep in mind that before you disinfect, you need to have clean water. Any organic material, your UV and chlorine is going to try and oxidize, so it's going to be expensive in terms of disinfection, but there will always be the possibility that something is hiding in those particles, and that's why you want to clean it. And then you'd go to storage, distribution, pumping, we will touch on shortly. Wastewater treatment, we'll touch on this lightly, but as mentioned, as custodians of the water passing through your land or through your property, through your house, it's good to understand where these are going and how we can manage them and help manage them downstream. So you have your wastewater coming in. Once again, you'll have a screen to remove whatever large solids and plastics and whatever gets in there. Grit removal, sand and so forth. Often on large scale, they'll have fat traps and so forth to skim off the fat layer from the soaps and whatever. And then you'd have primary clarification, which is just slow agitation and the sludge starts to settle. Aeration, this is kind of the heart of a wastewater treatment works. Basically having a biome of bacteria that is consuming all the nutrients that have landed up there. And it's quite amazing how in creation there's something that's going to manage to deal with most pollutants and break it down in some form. Obviously, the concentrations are an issue, and this is why they need to aerate to basically keep this farm of bacteria alive to be able to consume the sludge. And yeah, so aeration. This has become a big issue with load shedding, where wastewater treatment works, if they can't aerate for a certain amount of time, they are going to lose their population of this beneficial bacteria, and then that causes a huge issue downstream, because your flow is still coming in, and the toilets and so forth are still flushing, and it needs to go somewhere. So many systems have been put in place to try and deal with that. But yeah, a sewage works, wastewater treatment works. If it's really smelling foul, then it's gone anaerobic, meaning it hasn't had enough oxygen, and it's going to take a good 2 weeks to build that up. That will then go through secondary clarification. The sludge will settle off, and once again, it will be pushed back. The water component and the sludge, they will dewater, sent to landfill. After that, it will go through filters, and then once again, disinfection right at the end. You want that water as clear as possible, so that you can deal with it. And then effluent, discharge to surface water. Note that one. If you're living downstream of any one or any town, this is going to be an issue. I worked in the water industry, chemical dosing systems predominantly for 9 years, and this is definitely an issue. When you have rain events, as you can see, the wastewater plant can only deal with a certain amount of water coming in, and then it floods, and the quality just deteriorates rapidly. And unfortunately, in many provinces, they're not even getting this right without any rain. So be aware of that. If you are downstream, this is part of the catchment above you. Keep that in mind. Test for it if need be, but potentially put in your own disinfection. Okay, filtration. So this is kind of moving a step back from chlorination, but I put it in here because many of us don't like the fact that there's still a residual chlorine in our drinking water, and filtration, especially with activated carbon, will be able to take that out. But keep in mind again, then, as with UV water, there's no residual. The storage of that water, once it's gone through the activated carbon, be careful, keep it in a cool, dark place, make sure that it's not open to whatever source of contamination. Take the layered approach. So if you can imagine, you are aiming for irrigation water. It's 120 microns, so that's 0.12 of a millimeter in terms of particle size that comes out in your final water. The layered approach means that you're taking away the larger particles and finally removing the smaller particles. If you put in a single filter that's say a 130 mesh, giving you 120 micron, you are going to block it very quickly with one leaf and a couple of twigs and whatever coming through. So you put larger filters, which will then allow the smaller particles to come through until you've cut it off to the particle size that you want to deal with. Below that, you would go to reverse osmosis and those sort of membranes, which are very expensive. And once again, when setting up a source of water for reverse osmosis, pre-treatment is crucial because of this fact. Backwashing and regeneration sludge, once again, you're going to end up with contamination of water that you need to deal with. Keep that in mind. I know reverse osmosis systems, you can have up to 20 times the water, the clean water that's come out. You're going to end up with waste 20 times more. And that's got to go somewhere, and it's concentrated as well. So keep that in mind. Distribution and storage. So once you have your clean water, what are you going to do with it? Remembering that you've had some rain, you want to store it, you've had a good winter, you want to store it, you've had your treatment process, which is potentially a lot slower than your actual consumption. So overnight you can run treatment, during the day you can do things with the water that you've stored. So ideally store it in a cool, dark, vented, secure, and obviously waterproof containment. The photo I've used here is of a reservoir. I know particularly in the States they're using this, but basically if you're designing a dam or a reservoir, try to keep your surface area as small as possible, because wind and sun are going to cause evaporation. You're going to have losses. This reservoir is filled with balls which float on the surface, which is great. As the levels fluctuate, they will move up and down. I don't know how they'd perform in the southeaster, but potentially you would have fences and so forth. But once again, if you have a natural layout that's good for a dam, keep in mind that flooding or damming up a watercourse is a potential cheap and easy way of doing things. You just build a dam wall. But you are going to have floods coming through there. You're going to have loads of silt coming through there. It's not the greatest position for a dam. Find something that's slightly in a different position with less of a catchment area. That's easier to manage with all those parameters in mind. Use height to your advantage, as I've mentioned, but let's just once again, it's really an important thing to do on any piece of land. If you have water coming in from the mountains or so forth, try and store it as high as possible, or store it on a logical height. Water pressure is also expensive. We'll deal with that in the piping section. And then, water tanks should be carefully installed and maintained. You will still have sediment and things building up in your water tanks. Most people have an outlet at the base of their water tank, meaning you're going to have sedimentation building up and then slowly flowing into your water, which you'll have to treat. So deal with or use your water tanks and water storage as part of the treatment process. Piping, so sizing and pressure determination. There are many irrigation specialists and so on who want to sell you equipment, and often they'll give you really good advice free of charge or at a minimal design fee. So keep that in mind. It is expensive, and the higher the pressure, the thicker the pipe wall, the more expensive the pipe is going to be. Keep all those considerations in mind. And then types of piping, copper as traditionally was used in houses and things. Many of you might have seen the results of copper piping with water that's not in an ideal state. The green ring around the bath, or pipe bursts, meaning that copper has been leached into your water. Copper is also a great disinfector, so it has its purpose in place, but just keep it in mind when using it. PVC pipes, HDPE pipes, those are all both plastics which predominantly are being used in modern systems, whether it be rural or urban uses. When installing a pipeline, whatever size it is, keep in mind that scour valves and air valves are going to be needed at some point. So as with this little sketch below, these are both scour valves which you'd put on a high point, air release valves which you'd put on a high point so that air bubble has somewhere to go through. This valve will allow air through but not water. And those bubbles can cause various issues and damage in terms of water hammer and things further downstream. But scour valves would be at a low point again, where you're going to have sedimentation and things building up, where you want to drain the line. Put a valve at a low point, you won't be sorry. Burying piping and cables in a sand bedding. So for theft, for fire, for UV, it's expensive, but in the long run makes a lot of sense. Once you've buried your pipe, put in markers so that you know where it runs through your property. Remember the potentially cables that need to run to certain points for power or for control purposes. So throw in an extra piece of cheap irrigation pipe with a draw wire that you can pull through cables in future, or make sure you've finished the design and you know what cables you're going to be needing. A sand bedding is always great, especially if there's tractors or roads or anything happening. If you have a pipe in a hole and there's a stone on it and you drive over it, that stone is going to cause a leak at some point. And then paint above ground pipes. Once again, cool, dark place. It will use a silver or a white paint. It doesn't look great, but it reflects the UV rays. It will prolong the life of your pipes, as well as keep the water cooler. Pumps, once again, an integral part of the system. And an expensive part. So once again, water quality comes into play in terms of determining what pump you can use, and then the actual utilization of that pump. Get some professional advice on that. Solar is a great solution. There's a lot of technology that's coming out in terms of pumping. So keep that in mind. If you have a borehole with a lower yield, or that you can pump continuously when the sun shines, make use of that, and then put all the other things in place. Install monitoring and pressure gauges. Install and monitor pressure gauges. So often the guys that do the installations will put in pressure gauges, but note what the initial pressure was, and keep a record of that pressure. As mentioned, as you bore, the aquifer level lowers, you're going to have pressure changes, as well as fouling of your pipes. When your pipe gets constricted, you're going to have a change in pressure. Your filters, when your filters get blocked, you're going to have a change in pressure. So pressure gauges are a bit of a window into what's happening in the pipes, and get to know your system and monitor those gauges. Flooded suction on pumps is always great. It's not always practical, but meaning your pump is slightly lower than the water source. It helps a lot with various things. Control philosophies and standby. Think through your process and the control of it. When you want to go away for a weekend, your system might need to run if you're living out in the Karoo. So cater for that early on. As I say, even if it's just pulling in a sleeve so that you can pull through wiring, or nowadays there's all sorts of electronic ways of doing things, Wi-Fi and telemetering and so forth. And then a standby. Often the pump is the heart of a system. If you're extracting from a river or anything, if your pump goes down, you might lose a crop, you might lose an orchard, you might lose something if it takes you a couple of days to get a new pump in. So have a backup system. Keep that in mind. Use storage as a buffer where needed. As mentioned, if you have a bore that has a low yield, pump all day, pump all night, full tanks, so that when you need it and need the volumes, you can proceed with that. And then secure against the elements, theft, fire, floods. Keep those things in mind early on. Plan for it. Okay. And that was my say. We'll deal with a few questions later on. But now that you have sourced your water and have dealt with it and gotten to a point where you can use it, obviously household use we know about, but Nordely will touch on irrigation management. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So we'll dive right into it. Okay, so irrigation management is all about inputs and losses, or losses and inputs, depending on which day you're starting from. Okay, so losses in terms of your soil and crop system is evaporation, transpiration. I see I wrote run-off. Instead of runoff, and subsurface flow. And then our inputs are looking at rain, irrigation, and capillary rise. So we have a bit of a diagram here. So evaporation and transpiration is the main points here involving your crop. So evaporation from your soil surface. So if you're applying water to your crop, you're getting losses from the soil itself and also everything that the plant is removing from the soil and coming through the leaves as transpiration. So both of those are losses there. And then also you have losses in terms of water that's not captured, for example, runoff. So even for an irrigation system or rain, you have runoff losses. So for example, it's rained 50 millimeters, okay? But the problem is that 50 millimeters of rain happened in 20 minutes or half an hour. So if your soil is not able to capture that, it'll end up running off. So you don't actually have that 50 millimeters of water in your soil. So we need to look at these various areas. So when you're planning your irrigation, we'll get into the details of how you can look at infiltration and so on. But yeah, these are the main factors that you can look at. Also, if you have a water table, then there's capillary rise, which is also an input, which basically what will happen is from your water table at the base, capillary rise can feed your roots. It'll feed water upwards into the system. Deep percolation, this is very important. So if you don't have runoff, the rain will be going into deep percolation and filling your soil, filling your water table, which is your shallow groundwater source, if we can call it that. So that's also good to have deep percolation. For example, one thing you can do if you don't want too much runoff and to improve deep percolation is in a garden or in a system, if you have a mulch and you have a bit more of a sandy layer and so on, you can get the faster water penetrating a lot quicker. Then, for example, if you have a clay layer on the surface that is preventing water moving quickly into the surface of the soil. Okay, so that's very broad. Okay, then the aim of irrigation is to keep the root zone moist. Okay, so that's very important to think about. We'll get into some details on that. But yeah, basically what you want to do is you want to keep your root system happy. You want to keep your root system moist. Okay. Also, then again, not too wet. You'll be surprised in commercial agriculture what a huge problem this is. We often get to farms previously when I was working on a lot more water-related projects. We often see over-irrigation, and even on big commercial farms. And it is a challenge. Sometimes on commercial farms, they're working with very large areas that may have differences in soil types and so on with a single irrigation system, and that makes it tricky to manage. So managing water with varied soil types in a smaller area is easier. One of my colleagues used to say he just can't understand why the farmers just don't want to close the tap, which is sounds strange, but it happens. Okay, so where we want to keep the water, your irrigation levels, is near to this field capacity point. So as you can see here, if you're in this zone here, we call the gravitational water draining, is you've applied so much water to the soil that the soil can't actually hold on to it, and it will drain out. Okay, if there's nowhere for it to drain to, it will become a wet, mushy pool, and that obviously creates conditions of no air, which means your roots will die, because roots also need air. They actually the cells need oxygen to breathe and to function. Okay, and yeah, field capacity, I'll get to that, I think it's on the next slide, but you want a healthy water content in your soil. This area here is what we call plant available water. So when it's not being removed by gravity, the soil is actually holding onto that water, and the roots can then extract the water off the soil. When you get to a much drier soil, what we call permanent wilting point, is where there is still some water in the soil, but it's held on so tightly by the soil particles that the roots can't actually remove that from the soil particles. So basically what we call hygroscopic water. So also very important to note, different plants have different tolerances or abilities to be able to remove water. So some plants can withstand much drier conditions, whereas other plants will wilt a lot faster. Okay, so I just thought I'd put this in for those of you who are going to be sort of farming on a bit of a larger scale and are looking at a more formalized, shall we say, commercial type irrigation of crops. This is, I mean, you can do this on a you need a fairly large area to apply these sorts of principles. But the Penman-Monteith equation gives you the evapotranspiration reference value. Okay, so basically this equation is using weather data and to be able to determine how much evapotranspiration is happening. So of course the sun, the wind, temperature causes evaporation from your soil and from your plant or through transpiration. And using a crop factor, you can actually determine the actual volume, the actual amounts of water loss from your soil, which means you can calculate that, for example, on a weekly basis, so that you know for this week I need to add, 10 liters of water for a certain area, whatever the case may be. Okay, that's quite little, but you can calculate the exact values. Of course, this table here, the crop stage is very important. So there's a lot of these sorts of data points that are available already in the literature. So your initial phase and so on is going to have a specific initial phase crop coefficient, which you multiply with your evapotranspiration reference value, and those will actually give you your amounts and volumes of water. Okay, so yeah, just keep that in mind for those who are going big. Okay, field capacity. Okay, field capacity is a strange concept. It's an arbitrary value, but it's a very important value. Okay, so it's a parameter that will let you know how much water your soil can hold. Okay, so sandy soils, of course, they hold much less water. Clay soils can hold more water in terms of volume on a volume per volume basis. And the definition of field capacity is the soil water content that remains in the soil after 48 hours of free drainage from saturation point. So basically what you can do is you can saturate your soil, you can allow it 48 hours to drain, and then you can take a soil sample, and that amount of water in that soil sample will determine what your field capacity volume is, so the amount of water at field capacity. And this is basically your reference point to where you want to irrigate. So every time you irrigate, you want to fill your soil to field capacity point. Okay. Yeah, so if you go over that limit, of course, the water is going to drain out, and you want to just fill it to there. Okay, so this table that we have here, or graphic, shows the different soil textures. So here you have sand, sandy loam, silt, clay loam clay. So as you can see, smaller pore size holds more water, whereas the greater pore sizes it's a lower porosity, so you actually have lower amount of pores volume-wise, and you can also, it doesn't hold onto as much water. And there you can see the percentages of water content. So sandy soils hold very little water, and you can see also though, clay soils hold a lot more water, but here you can see this line here shows you how much available water there is above it. Clay soils also hold on to a lot more water. So they have more water content, but you can't drain them as dry as sandy soils, for example. Okay, so there's some of this information is available. Online there's even sort of small applications and so on. You put in your soil texture, you can put in and enter in certain values, and it'll give you some outputs. So there are some online tools available for determining these amounts. Okay, another online tool for irrigation management. This is also for larger scale crop systems. It won't be for a mixed cropping system, so this will be for small orchards and so on. So not a sort of mixture of things, or not a garden setup, but more larger scale. It's called Fruitlook, fruitlook.co.za. It's actually in collaboration with a Dutch company called eLeaf. They actually manage all the data content from there. This online system can give you information about the moisture, the reference evapotranspiration, and also an NDVI image, which is basically a vegetative index that shows you how healthy your crop is. This is all runs on satellite and weather data. And in the Western Cape, this is free because the Western Cape Department of Agriculture pays for the service. So you can go in, you find on the map online, you create a username and login and so on, and you can actually find your field and draw it out on the system, and then you can get the data on a weekly basis for that piece of land. Okay, so it might be interesting for some of you. Okay, so how much water do I need? It's a tricky question. Of course, it depends on a lot of other data inputs. But your water volume demand and rooting depth is something you will need to discover. Your crop tolerance to water stress differs. For example, citrus is quite a thirsty plant, tree crop. It needs quite a lot of water. Something like an avocado is very sensitive to water logging. So if its roots are too wet, overly wet, it easily gets root diseases and suffers, and quite easily actually dies. And then also water deficit situations. So vines, for example, can withstand quite dry soils. They're quite hardy, and they can withstand quite a lot of or quite little water content in the soil. Like I mentioned earlier, biggest challenge is overwatering. So then also factors that increase water use, of course, are high temperatures and wind. Don't underestimate wind. Wind is often creates more of a deficit or causes more transpiration in the crop and loss of water than a high temperature. Okay. And if you have high temperatures with very dry air, it's the worst combination for water loss. Okay, rooting depth is also an important consideration. So vegetable crops have a shallower root system than tree crops, for example. So implementing long irrigation cycles or watering once a week might not be sufficient. So you need to consider, what is your rooting depth? What is the area of soil that you actually need to keep moist for those crops? Here's just a table. It shows a lot of vegetables, and you can see shallow-rooted, medium-rooted, and deep-rooted crops. So they all have different rooting systems. There is actually a very interesting document. I'm trying to think. I don't think I have the URL here in this presentation. but maybe I can post it afterwards. It was a study that was done on various rooting systems. So it actually shows you what the root system looks like for various crops, which is quite interesting. Fascinating to see the different structures. When we talk about roots, we're talking about depth and volumes and so on, and we also look at architecture of the roots, how they branch and grow. And those are all quite different. So as interesting as the crop looks above ground, it's even more interesting actually below. Okay, then, after saying all of that, the best tool for managing your irrigation and managing water is a spade. Often visiting the farms and so on, the farmer, if a guy comes onto the farm and he's trying to sell these fancy water probes and all sorts of things, but he doesn't also have a spade with him, the farmer's not impressed. Okay, so the best tool is actually to dig a hole. You need to, especially in the early stage of learning the lay of your land and learning to get to know your soil, is actually to use a spade. Dig a hole, have a look at the soil. What does it look like, so that you can actually get a feel for the water management. Okay, so water quality demand. So of course there's volumes. How much do you need? But what kind of water quality do you need? Okay, so different crops, of course, have different preferences and tolerance levels for the two major things, salinity and pH. Okay, so the table here, we have crops listed and their preferred pH. As you can see with the berries on the top, blueberry, many of you probably know already if you've done some gardening, that blueberries prefer an acid type soil. That's quite important for blueberries actually to do well, that they need that acid soil. Okay, so this is the preferred pH. Certain crops have higher tolerance outside of those pHs and others have less tolerance. So this doesn't show the tolerance, it just shows the preferred pH. Okay. And then we go on to asparagus here is our most tolerant for pH actually in this table. Okay, so pH, but then also salinity or acidity, for example. I don't know if anybody knows what this crop is. This is something that we don't really see much of, or we don't have much of it here, but these are actually pistachios. Okay, so, and pistachios are one of the most saline and sodic resistant tree crops. So they can grow in very, very salty soils, quite surprisingly, so they can withstand quite well. So if you do have soil, if you already have a piece of land, your soil is more saline, you have salts, or perhaps your soil doesn't have salts, but your water has salts, you will need to look at crops that are more resilient in those types of scenarios. It is possible to grow good crops in more adverse conditions. Of course, it is more difficult, and what you can grow shrinks quite a lot, especially if the situation is quite severe. But it is possible to have a nice crop. So you can grow lots of pistachios. Everybody can have pistachios at least. That's a great nut to eat. Okay. This is also a table looking at pH. This shows the nutrient availability at different pHs. Okay, so your soil pH not only affects your crop and the function, but also the availability of nutrients. Okay, so of course chemistry is like that. At differing pH values, nutrients are either in a soluble form or an insoluble form. Okay, so at a slightly acidic pH, so from 6 to 6.5, most of your nutrients are available. Okay, so that's sort of like this ideal, and this next one here, very slightly acidic, is also your nutrients are available at in those parameters. Okay, or at those ranges. So that's also something to think about, soil pH, making nutrients available, and at the same time then considering your water pH as well. Something we didn't mention earlier, maybe in terms of water quality, is that if you have good soil, but you have very poor water, if you have very salty water, I'd advise that you think carefully before irrigating, because you will create a situation where you are putting salts into your soil, and once they're there, they're very, very difficult to get rid of. If in some cases, it's impossible, depending on what type of salts it is. Okay. Yeah, I have another slide on that, so we'll circle back to that a bit later again. Okay, soil type effects. Okay, so different types of soils, we mentioned this before, but just in terms of how to irrigate. So clay soils hold more water, so you have to irrigate less often. Sandy soils hold less water, so you need to irrigate more often. Okay, organic matter holds more water, so you irrigate less often. So organic matter plays a huge role in the ability of the soil to hold on to moisture. Soil restrictions depending on the soil type. So if you have also on the placement of your beds and so on, if you are working on a bit of a slope, you can have runoff. Soil types can have compaction and soil textural changes that also affect the management of your irrigation. Okay, so yeah, factors that increase watering frequency will be poor water holding capacity, saline soils also. So in a saline soil, because you have such a high salt content, your osmotic potential, which is basically the water potential through osmosis, is much higher, which means that even though your soil is wet, the plant can't absorb that water because of the high salt content. So you need to actually add, it needs to be very wet for in a saline soil to have the plants happy. Okay. Then also damaged roots. That's something that one can also consider in terms of if your plant is a bit sick and so on. You'd have to monitor that, because if you have damaged roots, you'd need to probably irrigate more so that the plant is not under stress. Ideally, you'd want to fix that problem, but yeah, if it's vegetable crops, for example, if you have tomato crops and you have a soil disease or a nematode infestation, the roots are damaged, and then you'll have to irrigate more often for the plant not to be under stress. Okay. Yeah, so this was just a specific point on salts. Saline soils or saline water sources, as we mentioned. So your plant transpire and water evaporates from the soil, but the salt remains behind. So what you have is a bit of accumulation of salts, especially on the surface. So this is a pistachio orchard that I did some work in quite a few years ago. And this horrible black surface area is what we call, I've forgotten the name. But it's basically, this is a black sodic soil. There you go. So black sodic soil. And this is basically such high sodium levels that it causes dispersion of the clay, this terrible crusting, and actually the soil even turns a dark color like this. So this is a very extreme situation. This orchard, to be honest, that looks like this is not doing so well. But the pistachios, nonetheless, they are harvesting from this area and so on as well. Okay, so in terms of irrigation systems, what do we need to consider also? Your soil infiltration rate, okay? We mentioned that earlier. It has a lot to do with not just the rainwater and so on, but also your irrigation system itself. And how can you test your soil infiltration rates? You can use a double ring infiltrometer. If you Google double ring infiltrometer, you'll be able to see how to use one. You can make one yourself as well from different pieces of pipe sections. And basically what you're doing is you're looking and timing your water infiltration rate. You can do this on the soil surface, but what you can do is as well, if you have a soil and you dig into it and it's got variations in the soil, you can actually dig out and place this double ring within the soil, and measure the infiltration rate there. So say now you have a soil, it's got a sort of a sandy top layer, and then it's got more clay towards the bottom. It would be good to look at the infiltration rate that you have on the surface. But of course, if the clay is quite shallow, you need to look at that infiltration rate as well, to be able to understand what your water can absorb and at what rate it can take up water. Okay, so it's very important, of course, for your irrigation system that the delivery rate of your irrigation matches the infiltration rate of your soil. Otherwise, you'll have runoff and puddling, and that's what you don't want. Also, having, besides the anaerobic conditions of having a lot of water on the surface, in some soil types you can get what we call consolidation, and that's if you have a bit of a head of water and it's moving through the soil, the particles actually pack together tighter and you get a compaction developing. Okay, and that often occurs in flood irrigation systems, and if you have if you have a sandy soil, you get different types of soil. So this is very soil type specific. I mean, we're talking about sands and clays and so on as soil types, but there's a lot of variations in between. For example, a sand that all the particles are exactly the same size will not be as subject to this sort of compaction issue as opposed to a sand that has various sand particle sizes. So if it's got a high sand particle distribution, you get the smaller pieces packing in between the larger particles and causing compaction. Okay. Okay, so then types of irrigation. So drip irrigation, if some of you might know the company called Netafim, you can see their slogan there is grow more with less, which is always a great thing. And they are the leaders globally for irrigation. It's an Israeli company, so that's where the company started, and they're global now. We have offices and so on here in the Cape, and there are various offices around South Africa. David mentioned earlier, speaking to somebody with regards to piping and so on. They, of course, do a lot of piping, and they do large-scale irrigation installations. But they're also, they have a lot of online information. Here I have there's an article, for example, do's and don'ts of drip irrigation. And also they have a handbook for small-scale farmers, which can be useful. Okay, so looking at drip irrigation has a higher water quality demand than other irrigation types. So your water does need to be cleaner when you're using a drip irrigation system, but you use less water. At the end of the day, it's a much more efficient system. Okay, so you have less losses to evaporation and to drainage when you're using a drip irrigation system, and it's preferred in most situations. It's also quite cost effective compared to for example, micro irrigation systems they have various parts and so on, and drip irrigation is quite simple in that sense. Okay, so micro irrigation, then you can see, those of you who don't know what micro irrigation is, those little mini sprinklers. Okay, so that's termed micro irrigation. So it's efficient when compared to sprinkler type irrigation, but of course not as efficient as drip. It could be preferred when planting mixed crops or cover crops under orchards. So in some cases, it is preferred over drip irrigation. That also depends on your soil type and the crop. So of course, sprinkler irrigation, if you're looking at for grains and row crops on a larger scale, sprinkler irrigation is better. Micro sprinkler irrigation can be beneficial in orchards if the correct sprinkler is selected, if water penetration is good and runoff can be prevented. Okay, so there are some considerations in terms of which one you choose. In greenhouse and nurseries, micro sprinklers are also used for cooling and humidity control. This is also a consideration in very sort of dry areas where you have hot conditions, where you actually want to keep the upper layer of your soil also cooler. It can be considered because we know in very hot regions what often happens is your soil temperature can increase quite a lot, and then your root function as well as your beneficial microbes and so on in the upper layer of your soil can suffer. Okay. Sometimes these overhead micro sprinklers, they actually have them on poles at the top. They're also sometimes used for combating sort of frost situations and so on as well. Okay. Okay, then if you're aiming for a permaculture system, which is great, you can think about, is my climate conducive to setting up a cropping system where irrigation is only necessary in the establishment phase, in sort of subtropical and tropical climates, and also perhaps in certain more specific savanna areas and riverine zones. If you have a bit of a more protected area that has higher rainfall and so on, you can consider setting up a permaculture system where you don't really need to irrigate. But in most parts in South Africa, we have quite a harsh semi-desert climate. So, okay. So yeah, so food forest establishment, once you create a food forest, you create a microclimate on its own, which makes your irrigation management quite different. Okay. Then also organic matter is extremely important. So soils with as little as 2% organic matter can reduce the irrigation need by 75% when compared to soils having less than 1%. So by adding 1% of organic matter, you can save a huge amount of water. When we're talking about organic matter and percentages, you know, if you have a soil with 5% organic matter, that's absolutely huge, okay? Most soils in South Africa have between 1 to 2%, and now with a lot of soil degradation, it's more moving to below 1% in some of the cropping areas. And yeah, the need for not tilling in the larger landscapes is very important for maintaining that organic matter. Okay, so composting, very, very important to increase that organic matter and increase your soil's water holding capacity. Okay, so again, trying to look at less irrigation and a more self-sustaining system. The permaculture principles of observe and analyze, establish plant guilds. So that's basically communities of plants that are supporting each other. You can look up online as well, plant guilds. And then also consider adding or converting existing garden beds into what they call heugel beds. So this is something I actually hadn't come across before, these heugel beds. But it's interesting because it's a similar principle in terms of the content of what you put down to the Ellen White, how to plant a tree, you know, the components that you're putting in that 1 meter by 1 meter hole for the Ellen White method. So it's quite interesting in that sense. So on this illustration, it's a bit more technical, but they have branches here. But on a lot of the information, if you look at it online for these heugel beds, they have like tree stumps and fairly large tree stumps that they're actually burying in the soil. And the way they're describing it is actually as a sponge. So once the stump has degraded somewhat, it becomes a reservoir for water in your bed. So that's actually quite interesting. Like I said, I hadn't seen it before, so yeah, I'm going to be doing a bit more reading up about that. Even in some of the cases, they're using these stumps and planting it in their sort of garden system on the edges of the paths and so on. So it's actually forming barriers and sponges for holding water in the garden setup. Okay, so yeah, that's quite interesting. And in terms of this picture that we have here, this illustration, most of what you will see is they have these very high sort of beds, and they're planting all over the top. In an area where you have a lot of sunshine and so on, this increased surface area will create a lot more moisture loss. So what you'd want to do is you kind of have this system, but you want to flatten it out so that you don't increase your surface area for radiation and drying out. Okay, so consider where you're doing this as well. A lot of this work comes from Europe and so on, and in Germany and Canada, and that where they have a lot wetter and milder climates than we do here. Okay, And then mulch, mulch, mulch. So yes, mulch on the surface helps a lot with reducing the evaporation from the soil. You want to keep that water that you have applied, you want to keep it in the soil. So you actually only want transpiration through your leaves. You don't want evaporation from the soil surface. That's a loss that is not useful. Okay, and monitor, of course, and make changes as needed. Yeah, so dig that hole, use the spade, and feel your soil and get a feel for what the moisture content should be. Okay. And then this is the last slide, and I'll just read it. God has poured out his love unstintingly as the showers that refresh the earth. He says, let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open and let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. When the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue faileth for thirst, I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in high places and fountains in the midst of the valleys, and I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry lands a spring of water. Isaiah 45, verse 8, 41, 17, and 18. That's from Mount of Blessing extract. Okay. So that's the end of the talk. I think we're going to look at some questions now. So we have some online questions. Okay, great.
That was very, very insightful, very technical. So we have a question on YouTube from Glenda, and I think, David, this question is directed to you. Does rainwater from my JoJo tank need to be chlorated, or is boiling it sufficient?
Yes, so heat is definitely a disinfectant. So no, boiling it would be sufficient. And something I didn't touch on is the fact that us as city dwellers and so forth get so used to purified water that our guts don't deal with it in the same way as someone living in a rural area or in Africa, for example. So your biome can also get used to a certain loading of contamination, bacteria, that sort of thing. But disinfection is always the safest route to go. That said, I love mountain water when I know the source is clean, and there's often a risk. So every rural household and traveler should have their charcoal handy for those instances. But JoJo tank, I would make sure, once again, know your catchment area, get on the roof, make sure your gutters are clean, try to keep the birds off and so forth. But yes, a bit of UV or a bit of even household jick. There's plenty of information on what concentrations to use there, but it is the safer route.
So I can maybe just say, in terms of the boiling water, depending on the loading of the bacterial and the contamination, just boiling the kettle once, for example, is not enough. That needs to be, you can look it up, you need to maintain that high temperature boiling for a certain amount of time to be able to kill off that bacteria.
Correct.
Okay, then we have a question from Richard. He's wondering, what is the cost of drilling a borehole?
Yeah, so that would depend on location. In an urban environment where the guys are drilling every day, I've heard of discounts when they're in your street already. Obviously, setup costs and so forth. Location, once again, it's always interesting to see the drillers in town. They'll charge you to kom wys water. They'll bring their sticks or their tape measure. Everyone's got their way. But 99% of the time, it's where they can get their truck. They'll say, okay, we must drill here. The costs, depending on how deep you're going to go and so forth, I would not know offhand. The size of the hole and how deep you're going to go, that's something you'd check with local drillers. Once again, sometimes it is better to get someone that's not in the area to come drill for you if they have a better reputation. Holes are expensive, machinery is expensive, so if the price differs drastically, you need to do a bit of research into the equipment that your driller is going to be using, because not every drill is the same. You might end up with a hole that's in the shape of a corkscrew if he hasn't got enough rigid support behind his drill, and that comes with all sorts of challenges. So beware of that and choose wisely.
Okay, a second question here, which I kind of had to ask Bromio, what does this mean? So how does fracting affect underground water? And does our government allow it, or have we done it recently in South Africa?
Sure. Yeah, I know there was a big debate about that in the Karoo, and hopefully Shell has pushed off. But yeah, it definitely would. I've heard in the US that there is great concern, as we saw with that sketch. You can imagine the different layers and aquifers, and you've been drilling or been extracting for years from a certain bed. Fracking could join those, and your pure water is now got a higher salinity component or something. But yeah, I'm not an expert on that, unfortunately.
Okay. And then another question here is the pH level of the soil. Can you maintain the pH level to the soil to prevent disease and pests on your vegetables and fruit?
Okay, so pH level is important for nutrient availability and plant function and so on, but it won't. That on by itself will not necessarily prevent disease on your crops. It's an important factor to look at. But yeah, the diseases themselves also have a preferred pH, so that's one of those things. But no, so pH is important, but that alone as a factor will not prevent disease on your roots.
I've heard people talk about hard and soft water. Can you maybe explain what is meant by hard water and what is meant by soft water, and what's the effect of the two?
Nordely's the chemist, yeah, so I'll hand that over to her.
Okay, so hard water actually means water that contains a lot of salts or a lot of cations. Okay, so calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium, and so on. Even your nitrates and all those components. So hard water is something that has a lot of nutrients also. But ions in, whereas soft water does not contain those. It's cleaner in a sense. It doesn't have all the solutes in the water.
Okay, and then a question on chemical pollution. If you get your water through a water system, so you're getting canal water or you're pumping your water from a river, and you want to grow organic, how do you manage the chemical pollution that's in the water that you're getting from?
Yeah, once again, those steps of water treatment would come into play. And closer to the end, you would filter through carbon. So activated carbon, again, is the best way to get rid of chemicals. If you look at permaculture and that approach, reed bed filtration, so letting that water run through reeds and vegetation and so on, obviously you're going to have losses. But that too can extract all sorts of nasty chemicals.
Okay, and then keeping your nutrition value of your water, if you put it through your filtration systems, how do you balance that so that you don't kill off all your nutrition value from your water and lose out on beneficial elements or microbes?
I can start on that, and Nordely can maybe chip in. So it depends on your raw water. As mentioned in the Cape, there's the softer acidic waters, which don't have much minerals at all. And the first thing you do is add minerals in terms of lime and so forth to stabilize it so that it's not going to attack your infrastructure. So I have seen local farmers and that making use of mineral stones and things. So the water has some minerals to leach into the system, whereas upcountry, minerals are you have too many in hard waters, and that's your treatment. You want to reduce that to a level, but Nordely will comment on what the crops prefer there.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to check also this. I think the question is regarding actually drinking water, or is it with regards to using? I'm not sure. Maybe is it for both? Okay. Okay, so for both. Okay, so yeah, in terms of drinking water and so on, of course, you'd like a water that has a mineral content. And I think after your whole purification system and so on, it would be safer in a sense to add the minerals afterwards. Some purification systems, depending on what you want to remove, you will still have the minerals in your water. So depending on the steps you're following. So that will maintain the mineral content. But in terms of the microbes, in terms of drinking water, I prefer to remove most of them. In any case, if we're drinking water, we're not really getting the microbiome in that sense. Not so much from water. Okay, and then in terms of irrigation water for microbes, again, that's not really in terms of what I know. I must admit I haven't dealt too much with this, but the microbes that you're getting is often present and so on in the soil. In most cases, when we're looking at microbes coming from water sources, it's actually bad microbes, so soil diseases and so on. Just this week, actually, we were talking about a particular soil disease called Phytophthora that actually came in through a water source in a Mozambican farm. They were basically irrigating their crop with the disease. So the disease was in the water. Often that disease is usually present in the soil, but they didn't know it was in their water. So they were basically putting more disease and more disease every time they irrigated their crop. It is a bit more rare that happens, but yeah, it does happen. So yeah, definitely, I think taking microbes and things out of the system is a safer, better option, and then supplementing those microbes and so on in other ways would be preferred. Yeah.
Okay, then we have a question from Jonathan. Explain the advantages of raised beds, advantages of cover crops to increase humus in soil.
Okay, so raised beds is an interesting one. In the Western Cape and in many other growing areas, raised beds is often a way to increase your soil depth, okay, because what generally happens is either you have to remove basically a load of soil and add good soil, or you can create a raised bed and a good soil with nice organic matter and so on by creating a raised bed. Okay, so basically what it's doing is it's taking the smaller amount of good soil that you have, putting it together to make a mound so that you can grow a good crop on it. Okay, so yeah, what was the second part of that? Sorry.
Advantages of
cover crops. Okay, so cover crops are interesting. Cover crops, there's a few different reasons why you plant a cover crop. The first reason is soils don't like to be bare. Okay, soil wants to be covered. It protects the soil from drying out. It protects the microbial life. It maintains the soil moisture. So to have a cover crop ensures that you're covering the soil. That's why it's called a cover crop, because it covers. Okay, and then it also often cover crops are usually fast growing. Depending on the types of cover crops you're looking at, cover crops are also often used to increase nitrogen. So if you're looking at clovers or vetch or something like that, you're increasing nitrogen input into the soil. Other cover crops that they also use for biofumigation are brassica type crops. So mustard greens, like rocket as well, can be used as a cover crop. So those also have benefits in terms of disease control. But your cover crop is adding root biomass also to your soil and adding diversity. That's the last one. So much bigger diversity means above ground. Okay, so if you have more diverse plants, you also have a more diverse microbial system. And the more diverse microbial system is able to fight disease better. So yeah, it's on multiple factors. It's the physical aspects of water and management of that, then the biological and as well as the nutritional side, adding nitrogen, adding organic material and so on with root growth. Yeah.
Okay, then a question on, you bought a new property. How do you determine your 50 and 100-year watermark? I think that's a broad question because especially this last 2 years, that 100-year watermark has, I think, increased.
Ask your neighbors.
Yeah, no, so I think historical data would help. Knowing your catchment, once again, if there is a dam as a buffer. I'm just thinking of citrus dole areas and those places where the dam is a great buffer, but at some point when you've just had too much rain and you get a flood coming through again, then it's unprecedented levels or far back. But yeah, in the Cape, we've had 1 in 100-year floods kind of every couple of years now, the last bit, as Michelle mentioned. So it's something that the civil engineers and those guys, they deal with that, but it comes down to historical data. And then looking at the lay of your land, if you're in a tighter gorge, that water's going to have to go somewhere. If the valley is more spread out, it will take a lot more volume. But flooding isn't a bad thing. I mean, Egypt was built on the silt lands. Be prepared for it. Make sure you remove your pumps and things. Don't plant orchards in areas that can get flooded and you lose trees. But other crops, plant between the flooding seasons and make use of those lands for silt and so forth.
Nice. And then water on the leaves of your plant. There's a lot of hype about rather using drip instead of sprinklers because the leaves don't like the water on the plants. But I have a question about that because, you know, if we look back in the biblical terms, before there was rain, it was dew on the water that irrigated. So is it really that bad? I understand there's certain plants that don't like it and certain plants that do, but how do you balance between that?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I don't think leaves mind it so much. The extended time that it's wet is a problem. So yeah, in the biblical times, I think the dew is generally something that's only in the morning dew. So it will dry up in the course of the morning and then you won't have it. The problem occurs when you have continuous free water on the leaf surface for disease. So a lot of diseases need free water. So especially what we call oomycetes, okay, but so they'll basically infect the leaf and so on when there's a lot of free water. So it's not a problem to have water on your leaves, but for an extended time. So if you're having water on your leaf the whole day, that's not good. But if it's just in the morning and it's going to dry up relatively quickly throughout the day, then it's not an issue.
Okay, and then drip irrigation and field capacity. if you look at drip irrigation, it's sometimes fast spread or too close spread, and a lot of times the soils, it only wets exactly where it drips. It doesn't really go to the broader field. Is that really good for the rest of your ground, because you're basically just keeping this one plant alive and you're not irrigating the full ground?
Yeah, no, definitely. So that can be issues. So that you need to consider that in terms of the type of crop you're looking at and the system. So yeah, if you have tree crops, for example, if you're looking, for example, an apple or citrus orchard, and depending on how the orchard is spaced, you also don't want to water the whole soil and there's no crop growing there, because that's really a waste of your water. So drip irrigation. So for example, very sandy soils, drip irrigation is not great, because what you have is you're applying water and it'll run sort of straight down. So it has very little lateral flow of the water. So in a sort of very sandy, gravelly type soil, micro irrigation would be better to have that root zone irrigated properly. But at the end of the day, like when we started off talking about the irrigation part, is the aim is to wet the root zone. So you need to consider, what is my root zone, and then adapt according to that. But yeah, there is a drip is not ideal in all cases. Yeah.
The last question is composting, adding composting for water retention, but can you go too far and have too much compost and it actually dries? And I'm asking this as a personal experience, because I ended up filling my boxes with almost only compost, and I'm battling in the summer to try and keep it wet. It's almost like it dries out way quicker than the ground.
Okay, but did you say in planting boxes? Yeah, so the problem is also in planting boxes, and if you have raised beds, that's why I mentioned earlier, you must actually flatten things out, because if you have an increased surface area, or if it's on boxes, it actually bakes from the sides and so on. So also, too much organic matter is not great, because also if you think of organic matter in terms of the volume of material you actually have, it's not a lot. Your bulk density actually of organic matter is a lot lower. So yes, it has a very good water holding capacity itself, but actually you have a lot of airspace in between there. So a volume to volume ratio wise, you've actually got less water holding capacity if you just have organic material. From a sort of volume perspective, there's not enough like little holes, because it's bigger particles. And yes, it also depends on the type of organic matter and the grade and how well it's composted. But yeah, so not too much compost is also. But yeah, in terms of soil, and when we're looking at organic matter and composting, for example, sort of long-term organic material, because organic material is also, like, we're using one word for something that has a very broad range in terms of chemical and physical properties. But at the end of the day, what I was talking about, that 1 to 2% is actually what we call sort of recalcitrant carbon or organic material. So it's basically particles that are not breaking down anymore. It's quite small. So that's why also the percentages are quite low in terms of that functionality. How's that?
Okay, and then Richard is still a little bit confused about the pH balance. He said he was told by a family that they could prevent disease on the one hand and pest with the pH balance. But I think you explained it, that it can help and it can also not help.
Yes. So no, it's definitely a parameter that is important. Also remembering that a specific pH balance and so on maintains functions of various things. So it's not the pH itself that's causing the change necessarily, but the fact that your nutrients are available at specific pHs, your microbes are happy at those pHs, so your system is overall functioning better at a particularly good pH. But it's not the pH itself, just for a technical point, that's causing that change. It's the effect of pH on all the other parameters that's causing there not to be disease. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much. That was very informative, and I think everybody enjoyed that. You
Thank
can close off with prayer for us. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah, and thanks to Michelle and Bram as well. We really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Let's close eyes. Dear Lord, we thank you for the beauty that surrounds and the water that feeds it all. And we thank you for this privilege now to discuss this topic. And we ask for a blessing on everyone that's out there dealing with water and various issues and trying to grow crops and so forth. Bless the knowledge that we've shared and help them to share it with their friends and neighbors too. Be with us all now, we pray. Amen.